Thank you, John. UT Energy Symposium, November 15th, 2022. We have two presentations: smart charging decisions for a fleet of shared autonomous vehicles and federal regulation of electric transmission opportunities and obstacles under recent legislation. Before I introduce our graduate student speakers, our next and final energy symposium for the semester will be on November 29th. We'll have a book talk on America's Energy Gamble, People, Economy, and Planet by Shanti Gamper Ravindran from the University of Pittsburgh. But today we have the pleasure of having two innovative student researchers, Matt Dean and Justin Davenport. Let me talk about Matt and Justin and what their presentations are. Matt Dean is an NSF Graduate Research Fellow and PhD candidate in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at UT Austin. He integrates large-scale impacts of on-demand mobility, electric vehicles, and ride sharing, as well as transportation and energy sector interdependencies. He's also examined pandemic effects on electric scooter demand and the reallocation of streets to support active transportation. His research has been published in Transportation Research Part D, Transportation Research Record, and Transport Geography, and he holds a BS and MS in Civil Engineering. Again, his discussion today will be smart charging decisions for a fleet of shared autonomous electric vehicles, SAEVs. Let me give you some quick background on that. Operations of on-demand shared autonomous electric vehicles or self-driving taxi services require careful consideration of idle vehicle dispatch to lower emissions, customer wait times, empty travel, and operating costs. We compare vehicle dispatch strategies using a traffic simulation tool to show how smart charging can lower daily electricity costs by 15% and emissions by 3% while serving more passengers on a price-agnostic strategy. Simulation results show the importance of fleet dispatch in charging and improving customer, fleet, and societal outcomes. The effect of electricity prices and shifting SAEV charging reveals policy recommendations to encourage more sustainable electrification of fleet vehicles. And then, Matt will be on for the first 20 minutes. Then we'll have Justin, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So let me introduce Justin. Justin Davenport is a third-year law student at UT Austin. He's also an associate editor for the Texas Law Review and staff editor for TJOGL, the Texas Journal of Oil, Gas, and Energy Law. While in law school, he has researched and written about legal hurdles surrounding new renewable energy development. His research focuses primarily on the barriers to building new interstate transmission infrastructure. He's also written about consumer protection issues in residential solar sales and has worked as a summer associate and clerk in law firms that specialize in energy finance and development. Before studying law, he worked over a decade in education, and after graduation, he plans to work as an attorney in the renewable energy space. His presentation, give you some background. To meet its goal of achieving net zero emissions and to slow the impact of climate change, the U.S. must rapidly build new sources of wind and solar energy. However, absent major improvements in the transmission grid, this will not be possible. The biggest barriers to constructing new transmission come from, one, the lack of federal power in siting transmission lines, and two, the cost of the lines themselves. Recent legislation and policy changes may make it easier to solve both of these problems. Justin will examine the patchwork of strategies that could help with transmission buildup, and will show how more expansive and targeted legislation could improve renewable energy development. Further, we'll have Q&A again after both presentations have completed. Please use the Q&A function online, not the chat. And so let me turn it over to Matt, and we'll get his presentation going. So you have to probably stop sharing or just share.
let's get right into it. So if you're joining us from Austin or online and live in Austin, maybe you've seen this cruise vehicle driving around town. It's currently mapping the streets to be able to fully autonomously drive in the next couple months, opening up to passenger service, I think December or January. So be on the lookout for this. And this is what I mean by shared autonomous electric vehicles. It's like an Uber and Lyft without the driver, and it's fully electric. And so I'm of course concerned about the climate crisis, how much transportation has to decarbonize to get to global climate goals. And one way to do this is to nudge people to use a shared mode, maybe even share a ride using electric vehicles. So I can figure out how this works. I will just advance on the computer. Okay, so at large, the transportation sector is facing three revolutions: electrification, automation, and shared mobility. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here at the Energy Institute, knowing that EVs offer multitude of benefits, including energy savings, you have air quality and climate benefits, as well as the expectation that purchase price will be met with gas-powered vehicles in the coming years. Maybe the IRA will help with that. Automation in the future, with technology maturing, we may see a reduction in crashes, emissions, and congestion. And by lowering the cost, by removing that driver, we're able to get to 50 cents to $1 per passenger mile. And if you took Cat Metro for a paratransit ride, that costs about $3 to $6 per passenger mile. Of course, it varies in the US context versus globally. And if you're able to reduce that cost, what do we expect? Demand to increase. So we're expecting more miles and more hours driven with this new mode. And if you're able to passengers drive, you may make better use of your in-vehicle travel time. Of course, increases in demand may lead to increased congestion, but if you're able to share your vehicle with neighbors, families, and friends, and then while you're driving en route to your destination with other strangers, there we can take off those single occupant vehicles from the road, reduce energy consumption, and really realize these benefits for society. So SAEVs operating around a region with demand that varies spatially and temporally. That means we're going to have a lot of empty vehicle miles or unoccupied miles. There's going to be some for pickup, which could be improved with new routing algorithms. Lyft offers you the option to wait and save to figure out a better assignment. But there are also other hidden costs like charging and repositioning trips. And that's the focus of this presentation. Of course, if we remove your driver, you're able to actually use centralized idle dispatch strategy as opposed to saying, hey, driver, please go reposition to this area. We expect people from ACL to get out at this hour. Of course, some of our study assumptions that we use in the literature are based on heuristics or an optimization-based approach. Whenever you see a result that say, we're gonna get 20% cost savings, ask yourself, how did they get there? Are they assuming that all vehicles start with a full battery and then charge when the battery hits low? Well, that's going to happen towards the end of the day. So you're going to have many vehicles charging at once. And of course, know that all of the assumptions about electric vehicles are dependent upon the speed at which you're charging, the battery capacity or range of those vehicles, and where the locations of the chargers are. So when I say simulate, I'm saying we want to be able to simulate a region's daily trips, knowing where the people are, their vehicles, what activities are they taking during that day, school, work, or other trip, and that generates a synthetic data set of trips. And we're running this on supercomputers called TAC here, and the advantage here is they're able to do about 6 million trips in over an hour for a 24-hour simulation without any optimization modules. And when you do come and say, hey, I want to take this robo-taxi or self-driving taxi, that request comes in to a central mobility provider and dispatches the closest vehicle. And if you elect to share a trip with a stranger for a little bit of a fare credit, then we need to figure out how that new trip could delay you. So Uber just announced the return of shared Uber rides, saying you're not going to get more than 8 minutes of delay in your trip. Of course, if you're taking a 2-minute trip, that's not great. So there are additional percent delays as well. So the research question getting at how smart charging can lower costs and emissions. Well, this is exactly what we're trying to focus on, but how do we do that? We're looking at price signals here. So can pricing influence charging? And what if it's not just a retail rate that says you have off-peak and peak charging? What if we're able to pass down the actual cost of producing power through the wholesale market? And then what are the health and climate costs associated with uncontrolled versus smart charging? And are there any other additional effects that may be in play? So sometimes for large commercial sources of energy, they're going to add on a demand charge or a peak power rate fee. That's the amount of money for drawing a lot of power all at once. So if you add that on, are you shifting charging to another period where emission costs are higher? So that's another focus of our analysis. So to put this all together, we have this framework. On the left-hand side, we see our day-ahead charging and discharging program. On the right-hand side is this within-day dispatch problem. So say you have 3 electricity prices shown flat time of use, so peak and off-peak, and a wholesale price for the price fluctuates a day. Then you have your health and climate damages. So knowing how prices may change throughout the day, knowing your fleet size, knowing your energy consumption, so kilowatt hours per mile and the typical mileage that you do, we're able to figure out how much electricity to buy and sell at each hour for the next 24 hours. But how do we translate that into charging decisions at the vehicle level? So we figure out during the day where the vehicles are in the 6-county Austin region and figure out what the cost would be to send that vehicle to do charging and discharging, to do maintenance, if they're currently serving that passenger, or should we relocate that vehicle to areas where there's a supply deficit. So numerically, or just with a simple demonstration here, let's say that Austin is 4 zones and we have 5 vehicles. Really simple. We have 2 idle vehicles, vehicle 2 and vehicle 5, and an empty charging station in zone 4. If I tell you that there's a supply deficit in zone 1, basically that means if there is that additional trip, we're losing out on that. That passenger's not being served. So what we could do is we could relocate that idle vehicle 2 to zone 1. We could do the same thing with vehicle 5, or we could realize that there's also an open charging station. So we could both relocate vehicle 2 to zone 1 and vehicle 5 to zone 4 to go charge. So the solver's figuring out the least cost way to minimize supply deficits and charge vehicles when it's the opportunity arises, rather. So let's say that we figured out how much electricity to buy at a low cost period, figure out which vehicles to go charge or discharge. But what happens if ACL happens, if I don't know, more people decide to go to a park because it's really nice weather and they take this vehicle there? Our optimal decisions are going to deviate from what's happening throughout the day. And what if it got really hot outside, really cold? Our energy consumption is also going to change. So to do this, we call the hourly charge and discharge problem right before we solve for which vehicles to dispatch. So we're able to aggregate up all the vehicle battery levels to update what the fleet average is to figure out how much electricity to buy and sell. And the advantage of this is by the time 3 p.m. or 5 p.m. rolls around, we're solving for the next 24 hours. So while we're doing day 1, we're solving for day 2's next best case. So kind of another visual demonstration here. Every 6 seconds, we're keeping track of where the vehicle is throughout the network. We're also keeping track of those battery levels or states of charge. And that gets aggregated up to this charging and discharging problem, which figures out how much electricity to buy and sell. And then we translate that to those vehicle dispatch decisions at every quarter hour. And the reason why I'm doing these decisions at the quarter hour is because I want to allow for the previous charging or repositioning trip to occur. I want them to be moved throughout their network, moved throughout that region. And if I did 5 or 10 minutes, I may be over adjusting too much. And so here's that 6-county region again. I serve 1 vehicle per 125 residents. And this equates to about 7% of load share. So 7% of the day's typical trips are being met with this new taxi. And we're using these 240-mile range vehicles, accessing superchargers spaced out 1 station per 15 square miles. Obviously, maybe you can't do this in person, but there are all these white dots for these charging stations. The green dots are these maintenance depots along the north-south corridor, just for ease of access. And moving right along to electricity prices, I use the flat rate and a time of use rate, just 2 periods, peak and off peak. We know that wholesale prices vary widely throughout the day, so we use the method in the literature to create these typologies or characteristic days, non-peak day, a day where the price spikes, a day where the price peaks, and then a day where the min is so far from the average as opposed to max to the average. We also monetize the cost of emissions, so CO2, SO2, NOx, and PM2.5. And the largest piece of the pie is carbon dioxide, followed by sulfur dioxide and particulate matter. But we know that sulfur dioxide does lead to particulate matter indirectly, so that green share is actually a little larger than what's shown. Again, visually, these wholesale prices I grouped are from the Austin, load zone, and ERCOT on Wednesdays in 2019. So middle of the week, hopefully it's kind of representative of all possible days. Spike, I think, had the most, and the scale is quite phenomenal compared to the other days. So $1,200 compared to $75. And the green is the one that I ended up sampling, although I could have sampled any number of them. So what I'm comparing to is this price agnostic strategy that I published here, and that also compared that price agnostic strategy to charging heuristics, or where we consider charging as isolated from repositioning. So we're not looking at the same number of vehicles, whether we should charge or reposition. We're just saying, look at these vehicles to charge, look at these vehicles to reposition. So this price agnostic strategy is already improving upon baseline heuristics. So when I say I'm comparing to the price agnostic, indirectly, I'm also comparing to these heuristics. So I'm not going to make that case. So moving right into the impacts here, we see that a 240-mile range vehicle is going to travel to a charging station 3 times per day. Let's see if I can move this for people. I'm here, 3 miles per vehicle per day. And what this means is we're opportunistically charging. We're charging when the vehicle's nearby a charging station and demand and supply is well balanced. But what if I said charge only when the cost is low? Then we're going to reduce the number of charging trips by 1 per day. Of course, less downtime means more uptime. So we're serving more trips. We're able to increase the median number of trips per vehicle from 28 to 29. By being busier, we expect the wait time to also increase, but that's not necessarily the case here. Maybe 2.3 minutes. And we're going to increase our mileage. So the 240-mile range vehicle drives about 300 miles. And a cleaning heuristic that I added was saying after 15 consecutive trips, go to one of those 4 maintenance depots to get cleaned. This was added in response to COVID-19. We want our shared modes to be sanitary, and previous studies had ignored this extra cost. And because we're having these more cleaning trips, are going to increase our empty travel or unoccupied miles up a little bit. But another contributor is on the right-hand side, our price agnostic, and on the left-hand side are multi-stage charging and discharging. So the blue part is the percentage of empty travel. So it goes from a quarter to a third now. And the reason why is we're having 1 less charging trip, but we're saying charge now at this hour, but we don't consider where the vehicle locations are when we make that decision. So the vehicles are probably further away from charging locations. So that's why that cost can increase as well. Now, what's the I guess the benefit of that additional passenger? We find it's about $21 per vehicle per day, which is quite high. An advantage of using this method is that we're able to say minimize that supply deficit, but also minimize the deviation from our targets. So if the target says go buy it this hour, we're going to try to do that. But if the supply deficit is so egregious, we're going to penalize ourselves and say, hey, don't chase after that low energy cost, chase after that unmet passenger. So it is a little bit responsive in that sense. Of course, increased VNT or travel is going to increase our other hidden costs that we don't consider. Taxes, cleaning, tolls, maybe depreciation, wear and tear, battery degradation. So that's going to eat away at our $21 increase in revenue. And you're thinking electrification, the cost of electricity is so low compared to fuel and maintenance operating costs. Yes, that's true, but it's not trivial. So on the right-hand side, I show that the vehicle could save between 8 cents and $3 per vehicle per day. So if you imagine a fleet of Uber and Lyft and Austin, how many vehicles? That's thousands of vehicles. And if you look in the middle, multi-stage, I show the wholesale spike in the bottom and the retail rates flat and time of use. We're finding that the multi-stage strategy can insulate the fleet from spikes in prices, and the wholesale rates, even with that spike, is still cheaper than if you paid your retail rate from Austin Energy. This plot is showing a lot right here. I'm sorry for people in the room who can't quite see it. We're doing charging and discharging profiles by the hour for our prices to flatten down to off-peak. And everything that's in yellow has the additional demand charge or peak power rate fee. So if we consider a peak power rate fee and the different prices, off-peak is the only condition where you're not going to have any discharging. So the cost of electricity is already so low. So the fact is, just charge when it's low. Don't try to sell power back to the grid because you have a cost to incur for cycling the battery. So if the day is really cheap, just charge. But the main emphasis of this slide is how pricing is informed of smart charging. So let's look at spike in the bottom left-hand corner. The price at 5 p.m. is 63 times the daily average. So we're seeing a lot less charging here, but still some. So if a battery ended up being really low, we're going to send that vehicle to go charge. In the future, I may say, just wait 30 minutes to an hour until the price comes down. So that's something I want to follow up with. Another thing is for maintenance, we're considering that downtime is also pretty costly. So we're going to allow the vehicles to charge when it's doing maintenance because we want the vehicles to be out there serving passenger trips. And the most important thing, in my opinion, is emission damage. Those are the health and climate costs. So I did a scenario where we didn't have any carbon costs. We didn't monetize any of those health damages. And we found that 2 out of the 3 of the price and power rate scenarios increased damages. So then I said, what if we added on 40 tons, $40 per metric ton? Only 2 scenarios had an increase in damages. And those are associated with a peak power rate fee. And if we increase the social cost of carbon up to $200 per metric ton, we're going to see more reliable savings. And the benefits of multi-stage charging is also for the electricity grid. So we know that in 2019, Austin Energy's peak demand was between 4 and 5 p.m. So we're going to increase electricity or demand an order of magnitude of 30 megawatts, which is quite significant for a fleet. But with the multi-stage strategy, we're going to reduce that. So it's peak shaving right now. And of course, the benefit to the electricity company like Austin Energy is between 1 cent, 13 cents per vehicle per day. And that really depends upon the local grid conditions and assumptions on the lifespan of electrical substation equipment, for example. We know that this strategy reduces costs, both indirect and direct, but will increase the cost in everybody as far as more unoccupied travel, more congestion. But if people are willing to share rides with strangers on the route, we're going to increase our average vehicle occupancy, and that helps to reduce our net EVMT. So if you write this down, 300 vehicle miles traveled, but they're serving 400 miles of passenger demand. A result is that maybe we want to have more congestion pricing, new dynamic fares to say, if I have to go pick you up if you live 10 miles away from the nearest vehicle, you're going to have to pay a little extra. Or these vehicles may be geofenced to the narrow downtown Austin region. We know that pricing is a form of smart charging, and that the time of use structure can reduce peak load as well as fleet costs. So the flat time of use and spike shown here. But that wholesale prices are ultimately cheaper and can insulate the fleet against a spike in cost. And I only looked at day-ahead price forecasts. So as we know, there's also a within-day change or adjustment to prices. So if a fleet does the day ahead in advance and then adjust those prices with the within-day forecast, they're likely to see higher cost savings. And just as a final wrap up, the fleet could say, hey, we're serving our passengers with 100% renewable energy. The way that they do that is they buy green power or they buy unbundled RECs, which is just saying, here's how much energy I consume. I need to buy amount of X megawatt hours of zero carbon. But the real way, the hard way, I would argue, is aligning charging with low carbon or zero carbon. But there is a path forward there. So in conclusion, we find these 204-mile range vehicles can serve 20 rides per day, reducing costs by about 16% and emission costs by 3%. But while doing that, we're also going to see an increased passenger service because there's less downtime, but at an expense to more unoccupied travel. Utilities should also look at how peak power rate fees actually may increase emissions, but provide peak shaving benefits. And fleets, when allowed, should pay wholesale power prices to save on costs. Just as the future of electrified mobility depends on you, energy system operators. So California is moving to require the hourly price reflect grid costs and greenhouse gas emissions, whereas Texas, after going to Stern Uri, prohibited retail consumers and small commercial customers from accessing a wholesale index plan. So, thank you.
Let's see how that's coming out. Let me double check here. Okay, I think you're good.
Good, all right. Thanks for coming here, everybody. Like the professor said, I'm a law student, so I'm really going to try to keep this not so legal heavy. But I'm talking about interstate transmission. So if I can summarize the problem here pretty quickly for you, we need more interstate transmission. What I'm talking about are the large lattice transmission lines and crossing over states. We need this to deploy new renewables all over our grid to decarbonize, but there are several obstacles, and two that I identify and I'm proposing solutions for are, one is that even though this is an interstate project and generally the federal government, like at the national level, Congress, the federal government gets to regulate what's happening when you deal with things in interstate commerce, they don't really have a large role when it actually comes to approving where and when these sites are built, these transmission lines are built. States do, and that causes a lot of problems because state and federal goals don't always align. And then also transmission is just incredibly expensive. So I'm going to go through some proposals how we could fix that. Ultimately, some new legislation would really help it along. I'm going to be throwing a lot of acronyms out. The most important one that you probably don't know is about a year ago, there was a bill called the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, and it just seems like no one's just centered on what the actual name of that is. Sometimes it's called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. This is the bill that was passed a year ago when Build Back Better failed. And then more recently, we have the IRA, which I think is pretty well known. It's just basically a pared down version of Build Back Better. I'm also going to refer to Joe Manchin. Recently tried and failed to have some permitting reform. He's probably going to try again. I'm going to talk about a federal agency, FERC, and I'll throw out this term siting and permitting. And this is just a catch-all term to refer to whenever a project kind of gets its approval of where it can be built and can get all the permits that it needs. People use it for different terminology. I'm specifically focusing on, can the project be built? And then can the developer building that project get eminent domain authority, which means actually if a landowner won't sell this little strip of land, if that developer can seize that land and then like pay a fair price for it, which is very common in building out infrastructure. So 4 parts of this presentation. Let's first talk about the need for interstate transmission. I'm sure many people in this room know that we need interstate transmission so that we can get cheap renewable energy out to the population centers around the country. There's a bunch of other benefits to energy independence, cost savings. But if we look at this map from NREL's SEAM study, you see that load centers are in red, large population centers that need electricity are in red, but the other areas where there's really good renewable resources aren't. So we just need to take those electrons and move them to where they need to be. You might notice, hey, it looks like there's some overlap here in these red areas and some good wind and solar areas. And yeah, that's true, but we're talking about massive projects. So we also need a lot of like rural land where rent prices or lease prices for that land's not going to be very expensive. I picked the largest solar farm I could find. That's like 8 million panels. So it's a bit comically big, but that's in California, apparently. And how does this relate to climate change? Well, about 1/4 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from producing electricity. But that's only going to grow if we don't solve this problem, because, you know, as we just saw with the previous presentation, transportation is becoming more electrified. A lot of greenhouse gas emissions come from heating buildings and commercial and residential buildings, but that's shifting more to more efficient electric heating. And what we don't want is a whole fleet of electric vehicles, but they're still running off of fossil fuels when you go down the line. That's not the goal we're trying to see. And this graph here just shows that the more we build out transmission infrastructure, the more likely we are to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So let's get to the we're not to the super fun part, which is like analyzing legislation, which I'm sure we're all super excited about. Let's first talk about how you build transmission lines. Average transmission project takes about 10 years to build, but the kind I'm talking about will probably be much larger because, as you can see here, the longer the distance of a transmission project is, the longer it takes. If you cross state lines, you're now going to kind of double. Every time you cross a state line, you're going to have to repeat this arduous process of getting the line permitted through each state, and that increases it. So it's a lot. So the big barrier I identified here is that states have most of the siting authority. And it's really summed up with this quote here. Despite the interstate nature of the electric grid and electricity markets, states have virtually complete authority over the siting and permitting of interstate transmission lines. And, you know, from a legal perspective, this doesn't make that much sense compared to the rest of the infrastructure in our country. So we have other sources of producing electric energy, right? Coal, natural gas, and both of those rely on a large scale national infrastructure system. Railroads move coal from coal mines to coal powered plants. Pipelines crisscross our country, interstate and intrastate. And ultimately, the federal government has a large role to play in who gets to put those pipelines. So what I'm really advocating for is, let's just treat transmission lines, which are serving an almost identical purpose, getting electricity to end users at the end of this whole process. Let's treat them at least as good as we treat pipelines, okay? And then, you know, maybe even better, because they're moving clean energy rather than fossil fuels. So we have a 50-state system. I'm trying to just give a broad overview of what it looks like when you get approval at each state. This is what most states do. If you want to get an approval to go to run a transmission line through a state, you have to go usually to an entity called like a public utility commission, PUC. You jump through all their hoops, and then you're going to be able to site this transmission line. You have to get something usually called a certificate of public convenience and necessity. I'll call it a certificate. And what does that certificate do? It says, hey, if this all breaks down and I can't negotiate, you know, a fair price for your land so that I can build a line across it, well, then we're going to get to seize that land. But you're only going to get that if that's in the public's interest. And so this is where you get real lawyery. What does the word public mean? Okay, so many states interpret it differently. Actually, you can pretty much only interpret it two ways. So states, a lot of them say public just means the citizens and the businesses of a state. So let me give you a hypothetical. You have a lot of wind energy or potential wind energy in Oklahoma. You know, not a lot of load in Oklahoma compared to some places around there. Let's say you want to get that cheap renewable clean energy out to Tennessee. You're going to run a transmission line. You're going to go through Arkansas. Maybe no one in Arkansas actually gets to tap into this electricity. The state can just say, well, that's not in the public interest. We're not going to grant that to you. If they don't give you the certificate, you're probably not getting a project. There's also, beyond that, a lot of chances to slow the process down. The public gets to comment at every level. If a municipal, local, or a state agency makes a decision, you're open to a lawsuit saying that you made the wrong decision. So essentially, you could have a transmission line going over multiple states, and one state could kill that project. And I'm also pretending that states are being nice, because the reality is that there are different goals for the state and the federal government. A lot of these states are rural, and they might just be anti-renewables. And so if they can kill a project that's going to help renewables, well, then they might do that. There's also anti-competitive forces. If you have someone who's supplying electricity and they have a lot of lobbying power and they know that they can't compete with this cheap electricity, well, that benefits consumers, cheaper electricity prices, but that hurts them. And so they can lobby for this project to be denied. So what's the solution here? The solution is the federal government needs to just have the authority to actually step in and cite and permit this. It's not really that radical of an idea. In fact, in 2005, Congress gave the government this power, the federal government this power. They just did it poorly. And it turned out to be, it was a failure. In 2021, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act expanded this, and Manchin's permitting bill would make it even better. There are a lot of hoops you have to jump through in order for the federal government to get this permitting power, but the two big ones is that you have to have designated a special area called a transmission corridor, a national interest electric transmission corridor. And then you need the state to fail to act correctly in approving a project. So if you look here, we have two beautiful transmission corridors that haven't existed in 10 years. Because in 2011, what happened was that the federal government, there's a long process. Every 3 years, the Department of Energy does some research, they issue a report, and the Secretary of Energy can then go say, hey, this is an area experiencing congestion. Maybe we can build a transmission line through here. If something else happens, we get to take over. Okay, well, apparently the federal government didn't do this correctly. They didn't consult with the states enough. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles in doing this. And so a court threw this out. So there haven't been any transmission corridors in 11 years. So how does the Infrastructure Investment Job Act change this? Well, the Secretary of Energy still does this after 3 years. Manchin's bill actually just takes away this kind of 3-year requirement. The Secretary of Energy can just find it and they can just say, this is a transmission area. They even have a different name for it. But they make it much more friendly to renewables because you used to only be a corridor if you were at that moment experiencing transmission constraints. But now it's if you're experiencing transmission constraints or you're expected to experience transmission constraints. And candidly, that's a lot of the United States will be experiencing more and more transmission constraints, especially if we're building out more renewables. That doesn't change in Manchin's bill much. Also, factors have changed. So there's a whole list of like, okay, check the box. Does this meet this criteria, this criteria? None of them are dispositive, but the more you have, the more likely it is that you can get a corridor. And they've added things in like, does this help intermittent energy, which is just another way of saying renewable energy? Does it reduce electricity prices? It does. But there's a whole other failure happening with this. When the original bill, 2005 Energy Policy Act passed, they said you have to be in the transmission corridor and you have to have a state that withholds approval for over a year. Now, I think you and I and most people here withheld as you don't get it. If someone withholds something from you, that means that they didn't give it to you, right? Excuse me. That's not what the Fourth Circuit said. The Fourth Circuit says, no, withhold means you never make a decision. So as long as a state just formally denies a project, you can never use this power. And that's what states did. And so 2009, this power basically got taken away. In 2011, all transmission corridors got taken away, and we've never seen any movement on this since. So that's great. What changed? The Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act just went over that whole thing. It just said, hey, if a state denies a project and we think it needs to be built and it's in a transmission corridor, it's going to be built. So that's great. Manchin just says, why are we even going? Well, Manchin's bill, I don't even say this. Manchin's bill says, why are we even going through all these hurdles? The federal government should just have the power to cite these transmission lines. It's part of interstate commerce. We could do it. There's another really big problem with the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. How it doesn't go far enough is it allows you to seize land, but it only allows you to seize private land. Manchin's permitting bill allows you to seize state land. Why does that matter? I don't know if you've ever seen a map before, but you might have noticed that the United States has these things called rivers, and many times state boundaries are defined by rivers, state parks, state highways. You need that state land to build a transmission line. Riverbeds belong to the state legally. So states still basically have a veto if we don't solve the eminent domain problem with state land. There are also a couple other, I call it a patchwork approach. Let's say the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act is all we get. We could also try some other things like building along existing right-of-ways. This is a utopian view of highways and transmission lines. Railroads, pipelines, brownfields, that's a term that places that have already been developed. So like you're building along a rail line, odds are there's already been some environmental studies there. You're pretty aware of what species are there. And also it's not like pristine ground. People are going to be less upset for lack of a better term, you've got a gross pipeline somewhere. Now you got a gross transmission line right next to it. Okay. There's also the idea of undergrounding. Right now, that's way too expensive. But in the future, maybe people don't want to see these transmission lines. We bury them. There are a lot of problems with that, but it could be something in the future. Then also, there's a lot of federal land in the west, not so much in the east, and that federal land could be used to build transmission across. So the last big problem, which I'm a lot more hopeful about because of new legislation, is transmission lines are expensive, right? So how are we going to pay for them? Couple things. We can plan better and the government can issue loans. So right now, FERC, which regulates Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, they're regulating everything at a national level. They're really pushing for better long-term planning. And it really looks like they're looking to a great success story in Texas, which is CREZ. So you may have heard about CREZ, but I am a little short on time, so I'm not going to delve into it. Essentially, we had wind areas, but we didn't have any transmission for those wind areas. The state went out, identified them, contracted with developers to build transmission lines. They were completed in 2013. Here, you can see the graph takes off and wind development dramatically increases. The United States is like somewhere around the 5th largest wind producing power if we were a country, right? But solar also went on that as well. It's sunny and flat in the areas of Texas where it's windy as well. So that worked out. And we also have some pretty exciting loan programs now. So this transmission costs about maybe $1 million to $9 million per mile. So that's expensive. But the federal government now has this $1 billion loan fund. The IIJA, $2.5 billion of a revolving loan, being able to buy capacity in a line up to 40 years. The the Inflation Reduction Act adds to that. But one thing that I would argue is really, really missing is something called an investment tax credit. And so my last proposal would really be to push for legislation for an investment tax credit. If you don't know how those work, that's fine. They get pretty complicated, but you can make a whole career out of tax equity and funding projects. But essentially, every dollar you spend on a project, you get 30 cents back. And so that's going to make it much more affordable to build these. And if you want to see, this has been developed or deployed, tax credits have been used in wind, have been used in solar. And you can see when they end, there's a huge drop. When they come back, there's a large amount of development and money put into these projects. So that's basically it. If you take one thing away from this presentation, look at transmission lines a little differently. They're super important, even if they're not the most beautiful things on earth. And understand that we should just treat electricity and transmission infrastructure at least the same way we treat gas pipelines, natural gas pipelines. So thank you.
Thank you. 2 excellent presentations. Questions?
So what I understood, my
Which
question,
one, Matt or Justin?
my
I'm
question,
Justin.
is actually to the first present.
Matt. Okay.
So the question is, I understood you were advocating for smart charging for EVs. Can you look into the possibility of using telematic sensors into EVs so that the grid operators have a better understanding at what time EV owner would actually need electricity to charge its vehicle, and that can solve the problem in a way wherein the EV owners become the main set of thing to decide, rather than using the smart charging system as a bigger problem to deal with.
Yeah, so to summarize for everybody who's joining us online, the question was whether the grid, so say ERCOT, would want telematics in the vehicle to receive information about when the vehicle might want to charge, to be able to identify other smart charging mechanisms. So I think one of the perspectives is that's a risk of information that may be faulty through some type of hack to say, oh, everybody wants to charge now. That could be one thing. The second thing is the additional cost of having the grid operator need to aggregate all these additional loads or the anticipation of loads. Third is that I think it's much more simpler just to say align pricing with when it's low cost electricity or when the net load is low because of renewables in essence. I think for personal EVs, it's going to be different. So you may want to charge where you have access to charging. And so we kind of already know that from just cities that have public charging stations with a lot of multifamily dwelling units versus people who live in more rural areas that just charge at home, and that typically happens at night. So we already have an idea from early adopters and kind of attitudes of who's adopting them, where do they live, are they renters without access to charging? I think it's more the price they should be influencing charging.
Other question?
Yeah, I was curious, you said that the fleet would be about 7%. Was that like ride shares or like overall transportation needs?
Yes, the question was 7% mode share. So that's of all passenger travel. So that's your single occupant vehicle if you're driving with your spouse or your friend, if you're biking, walking, transit, all of that. It doesn't include freight trips. Freight's also an additional part of any type of background travel.
Okay, and about how many cars is that?
Oh gosh, how many cars? I don't know exactly how many cars it takes off. So what we did was we modified the mode choice model that the region's planning organization uses to say, this person is likely to take a vehicle trip because they have one vehicle, and two, it's easy to do that already. The cost is so low. So a lot of the trips that we have in our synthetic trip data set are otherwise going to be vehicle. We did it to tweak it and reduce the number of vehicles that were owned in anticipation of this service. So it's hard to know if they would have already taken a vehicle to make that comparison or that leap. But the fleet size they use is 15,000 for the 6-county region. 8,000. Of course, not all of the vehicles will be used throughout the day. So
I've got a question. So Justin, it seems like any of these states that don't really participate, if you're going, I don't want to call them flyover, maybe there's a better term, but if one state is the generation source and the other state is where it's really being transported to, I think you allude to situations where the states that the lines just go over don't really get a benefit. Are there any compensation schemes or other things that might make it in the public interest for those states to actually say, okay, well, we're not really consuming any of this, it's just flying through, just like trucks drive on the interstate through certain states on their way from one place to the other. Any thoughts about compensation schemes or other mechanisms to make those states more attracted to supporting transmission through their state?
Yeah, so I haven't delved super into that in my research, but historically, when a transmission line goes across your land, you're less likely to see any like royalty based off like the electricity that goes through there. It's more just you have to get an easement granted for a right of way there. It seems like there's a space for it, but they're already cost prohibitive, right? And so if we're building these large scale projects and they're already so expensive to the point where we're needing like federal assistance in them, every little cent matters. So I'm sure people have come up with some sort of solutions to that, but as of now, I don't know of any. And usually these newer long distance lines tend to be direct current HVDC lines, and HVDC lines, as I understand it, it's more expensive than to like tap into that electricity. And so it'd be great if they could benefit off of them, but then it gets cost prohibitive as well. But then there's just a gap in my research past that.
We had another question?
Yeah, I'm curious, for Manchin's bill, what is the likelihood you think of it actually getting passed? Is there any appetite with Republicans to support it? I know it looks like they're probably gonna win the House.
So you'll probably see a push for it to get passed. So now I'm taking off my like one hat and putting on my like pundit hat, which so I know much less about, but it's probably going to have a push. I've read that there's going to be like a defense bill because he tees this up to like energy independence and security, which it is. I think the issue with that bill is that he tried to force it through, and it's a permitting reform bill, which is a larger thing. So it takes a lot of time to get like environmental permits and get things regulated out. And I think that what happened there was, not that I think, I know what happened there, is that Joe Manchin is very moderate, right? So he's a Democrat, but he's very moderate. And so he comes from a coal state. He's much more pro fossil fuel. And so I would say Democrats were already upset that he had basically trimmed away so much of Build Back Better. At least we call this like Build Back Better grid is kind of what this section was called of it. That they weren't about to be like, oh yeah, let's rush through your pipelines. I'm at the point where I'm like, we just need the transmission authority. So if I were a politician, I'd be really just give up a lot for that. Republicans also weren't going to give another Democratic win after the IRA right before midterm election. So I think we have this opportunity now where if you could get 10 Republican senators just to support it and probably make it a little bit more, you might have to make it more pro-fossil fuel on that end and more pro-renewable at the same time. And hopefully it could be like old politics, which never thought I'd want those days, but where like every side kind of gets something and hate it at the same time and pass it. So I'm hopeful that it'll pass. I know that the Biden administration is relying on a lot of research coming out of Princeton. I forget what it's like the REPEAT project. And it seems to be a lot of the things that they're saying, then the Biden administration is taking that and really running with it. And they just had a huge report. One of my slides had that graph going down. They're very in favor of it. So you're at least going to have White House support of it. Chuck Schumer said that he was going to support this permitting bill as a way to have Manchin support the IRA. So you have Democratic leadership. Now you're just going to have to get Republican leadership. So it might change, but why not be optimistic?
Other questions? Okay, I've got a question online for Matt. Is demand for the SAEVs remaining constant throughout all 15-minute intervals of the day? Or are the vehicles' request for time varying based on the proxy like general traffic activity?
Yeah, it's generalizable to the demand in any type of travel or any type of automobile travel. You're gonna have a peak in the morning, a little bit of the decline in the day, and then another peak in the evening where the peak is more spread out. So, as you drive home, there's more travel in the evening and afternoon. So it's not all the same. Vehicles are going to be more idle at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and then again at 11 p.m.
Okay, and then I had some questions too here. Is there a need of the curve as far as the range? You were using 240-mile electric vehicle like a Bolt, I guess. Did you see any big difference in the results if you could get 300, 330? Where's the point of diminishing returns in terms of bigger battery size, hence longer range for those battery electrics that make a difference?
Yeah, so I did a comparison, and I think I started out with the 240-mile range vehicles that increased to like 330 or 320, and then dropped it down to like 150, 125, and the number of charging trips reduced with that higher battery. Now you still saw percent savings relative to price agnostic, but I didn't do the numbers to say, well, you purchased a bigger battery and now you have to drive it around, reduce energy consumption, or an increase in energy consumption, all that. I didn't play around with that, but I saw fewer charging trips at least, which could be advantageous. So then you could reduce the number of charging locations, just a few number, and increase charging speed. So.
And what was your DC fast charging rate assumption?
120 kilowatts, which is, I mean, 120 is kind of the baseline or new normal now as opposed to 150. A lot of electric vehicles are even going higher as the peak.
Yeah, CCS is at the 350 in the future.
And then Tesla just announced the NACS, the North American Conductor Standard.
Other questions? Well, okay. With that, thank our great presenters. We will see you on the 29th for our next UT Energy.